Your loved one did not change. The facility did not get busier overnight. The person you knew, the one who asked questions and told stories and knew exactly what they wanted for dinner, became someone quieter and slower and harder to reach. And somewhere in the back of your mind, you have been carrying the question of why. The answer, documented in federal court filings across 4 separate decades, is $5.6 billion. That is the combined amount that Johnson & Johnson, Eli Lilly, Abbott Laboratories, AstraZeneca, and Omnicare, the largest nursing home pharmacy in the country, now owned by CVS Health and headquartered in Woonsocket, Rhode Island, paid to settle federal charges for illegally marketing psychotropic drugs into nursing homes. Not for treatment, for control, for quiet, for the staffing savings that come when a resident who might otherwise require one-on-one attention has been chemically persuaded to stop requiring it. This is not a story about bad caregivers. The caregivers, in most cases, were told the medications were for comfort. This is a story about what the companies that supplied those medications were doing in the years before anyone with a badge showed up at a warehouse in New Jersey or a headquarters in Indianapolis, Indiana, to ask about the paperwork. By the end of this video, you will know the one federally mandated review that every nursing home is legally required to offer your loved one every single month. The review that could identify every psychotropic drug with no documented clinical basis and exactly how to demand it in writing. Johnson & Johnson, headquartered in New Brunswick, New Jersey, did not simply market Risperdal to nursing homes. They built a dedicated sales infrastructure for it. Between 1999 and 2005, the company deployed what internal documents described as an elder care sales force, a team whose specific and documented purpose was to drive Risperdal prescriptions in long-term care facilities. The mechanism was not subtle. Johnson & Johnson paid Omnicare pharmacists what the company described as educational grants and consultation fees. Federal prosecutors in the Eastern District of Pennsylvania described them differently. On November 4, 2013, the United States Department of Justice announced a $2.2 billion settlement with Janssen Pharmaceuticals, the Johnson & Johnson subsidiary responsible for Risperdal, pleading guilty to a criminal misdemeanor for misbranding the drug. Johnson & Johnson knew the FDA had not approved Risperdal for behavioral symptoms in elderly dementia patients. They sold it for exactly that use anyway. They paid people inside nursing home pharmacies to recommend it anyway. They wrote the grants down as grants. That is not a coincidence. That is a business model. The Eli Lilly case, filed in the Eastern District of Pennsylvania and settled on January 15, 2009, adds one detail that is almost difficult to read without setting the document down. Lilly's sales representatives used an internal shorthand, a phrase that appears verbatim in the DOJ court filing. The phrase was 5 at 5. 5 milligrams of Zyprexa administered at 5 in the afternoon to ensure that elderly residents were sedated before the night shift arrived and the staffing ratios dropped. The settlement reached $1.415 billion, which at the time was the largest individual corporate criminal fine in United States history, at $515 million. Eli Lilly was headquartered in Indianapolis, Indiana. The night shift got quieter. Nobody asked how. Abbott Laboratories, headquartered in Abbott Park, Illinois, ran a parallel operation for Depakote, an anticonvulsant the company targeted at nursing home residents with dementia-related agitation. Abbott trained a dedicated sales force specifically for nursing home placement. It continued those marketing efforts after discontinuing its own clinical trial in 1999 due to adverse events, including drowsiness, dehydration, and loss of appetite in elderly study participants. The sales force operated through 2006. Abbott paid $1.5 billion to resolve federal, criminal, and civil liability in 2012, filed in the Western District of Virginia. AstraZeneca, with its North American commercial headquarters in Wilmington, Delaware, settled for $520 million in federal penalties and an additional $68.5 million in a multi-state agreement for illegally marketing Seroquel into nursing homes. Omnicare, the pharmacy that supplied medications to more nursing homes than any other company in America, settled twice. $98 million in 2009 for its role in the Johnson & Johnson kickback arrangement. $28 million in 2016 for receiving payments from Abbott. CVS Health acquired Omnicare in 2015 for approximately $12.7 billion. The pharmacies that accepted those payments are now part of a company with a market capitalization larger than the gross domestic product of most countries. The part of this story that most people miss is not the settlement amounts. It is what the federal government found when it went back and looked at the prescribing patterns after the settlements were paid. A November 2022 report from the Office of the Inspector General, identified internally as report number OEI-07-20-00500, examined psychotropic drug use across nursing homes from 2011 through 2019. 80% of long-stay nursing home residents received at least one psychotropic drug during that window. When the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services launched a public initiative called the National Partnership to Improve Dementia Care, the reported antipsychotic rate fell from 23.9% to 14.5%. That looks like progress. The OIG found something different underneath it. Anticonvulsant prescriptions, the Depakote category, increased from 28% to 40% during the same period. The drugs did not disappear. They migrated to a category that did not trigger the same public reporting metrics. And then the OIG found a 194% increase in unsupported schizophrenia diagnoses, concentrated in 99 nursing homes across the country. Facilities falsifying the diagnosis on paper so that antipsychotic prescriptions in those residents would not count against the facility's publicly reported star rating. Schizophrenia diagnoses written into records for people who did not have schizophrenia. Written there so the drug use that was controlling them would not show up on the number that families checked before signing. If someone in your family is navigating any of this right now, consider subscribing. This channel publishes investigations like this regularly, and the next one covers something that affects an even larger number of families than what we have covered today. When you read through the full long-term trends of psychotropic drug use in nursing homes report, alongside the settlement documents and the CMS National Partnership data, what stands out is not the prescribing rates themselves, but the substitution pattern. And what that pattern tells you about exactly when the industry understood that public reporting metrics could be managed rather than improved. The pattern is not pharmaceutical companies behaving criminally in isolation. The pattern is a supply chain that was optimized specifically and deliberately for the conditions that nursing homes create. Low staffing ratios create behavioral management problems. Behavioral management problems create demand for pharmaceutical solutions. Pharmaceutical companies with drugs that were not approved for those solutions paid the people inside the pharmacy supply chain to recommend them anyway. The drugs made the behavioral management problems manageable. The staffing ratios stayed low. The margins stayed healthy. Nobody at the corporate level had to say it out loud. The FDA issued a black box warning in 2005 and a second black box warning in 2008, establishing that antipsychotic medications increase the risk of death in elderly patients with dementia by 60 to 70% compared to placebo. Both warnings were public. Both warnings were available to every pharmacy, every physician, and every nursing home operator in the country. The prescribing continued. What this data actually shows, when you look at it carefully, is not a compliance problem the industry was gradually resolving. It is a reporting problem the industry learned to manage. And the difference between those two things is the difference between a system that was trying to get better and a system that had decided the metrics were the product. That is the system, not a failure of it, the system. Your loved one, the one who became quieter and harder to reach, was living inside that system. And the number they use to convince you the facility is providing good care does not count the residents whose diagnoses were written to hide the drugs. Everything before this point is what the industry hopes you never find out. What follows is what they are genuinely afraid you will do with it. Federal regulation, specifically Title 42 of the Code of Federal Regulations, Section 483.45, requires every nursing home that participates in Medicare or Medicaid to provide a monthly pharmacist review of each resident's medication regimen. This is not a courtesy. It is a federally mandated review, and it exists specifically to catch medications with no documented clinical basis. Most families do not know it exists. Fewer have ever been offered it unprompted. First, go to the Medicare Care Compare tool and search your loved one's facility by name. Find the facility's reported antipsychotic rate. If it is above the national average, that is the first number worth questioning out loud in a written communication to the facility director. Time required, 15 minutes. Cost, none. What it prevents: the specific misrepresentation that your loved one's facility is managing medications conservatively when the data shows otherwise. Second, request a complete written medication list from the facility. Ask the attending or prescribing physician in writing to document the clinical indication for every psychotropic drug currently prescribed. The word agitation is not a diagnosis. Ask specifically what condition is being treated and what alternative interventions were attempted first. Third, ask directly whether your loved one carries a schizophrenia diagnosis in their current care record. If they do, and if that diagnosis was not present before admission, ask the prescribing physician to document in writing when and on what clinical basis it was added. Fourth, formally request a consulting pharmacist review in writing, citing the federal requirement under Title 42. The facility is required to make this review available. The review will identify every medication for which the documented clinical rationale is absent or insufficient. Keep the written response in your records. Fifth, if you believe medications are being used to manage behavior rather than to treat a documented condition, file a written complaint with your state's long-term care ombudsman. Ombudsman offices receive and investigate complaints at no cost to your family. This is not legal or medical advice. Any change to your loved one's medications must be made in consultation with their physician. The goal of these steps is to generate documentation, not to change medications unilaterally. The complete protocol requires approximately 2 to 3 hours across 1 week. The average cost of a nursing home stay is over $9,000 per month. The decision about what your loved one is being given every evening at 5 o'clock is worth 2 to 3 hours. Before this video, the $5.6 billion settlement record was a number that belonged to someone else's story. It was federal litigation. It was a press release from a building in Washington. It did not have a name attached to it that matched the person sitting in the chair at the end of the hallway. You now know what the federally mandated monthly pharmacist review is, where it comes from in federal regulation, and the exact language needed to demand it in writing. You know what a schizophrenia diagnosis written into a care record means for a facility's publicly reported antipsychotic rate. You know which 5 companies paid that combined $5.6 billion and what they paid for. Drop a comment if this matches what you have been experiencing, because the pattern of what families are going through is part of the story this channel is trying to document. Every video on this channel is built around one principle. Your family deserves to know how this system actually works before you are inside it. Subscribe so the next investigation reaches you in time to use it.